a cabinet that looks like Canada.
If I'm going to support a democratic governance system, I want to know that that system actually represents me and my people and communities of color and Black communities and Indigenous communities and brown communities.
I think it's very important because it offers that their point of view of First Nations communities, and it helps. It would be easier to talk about instead of having a non-Indigenous person start talking about First Nations communities.
I mean, we have institutional racism. It's rampant in government. It's rampant in social systems. It's rampant, and it's rampant and unaddressed.
If we want to create a Canada that's equitable, that treats all of us fairly, that treats all of us with a sense of dignity and pride, then we must address how race impacts us.
There is no democracy without a healthy public life, public education, public health care, public conversation. All the things that allow us to see the ways in which we're interdependent and interrelated.
Tonight, special guests, Celina Caesar-Chavannes, Rose LeMay, and Alykhan Velshi. Sit down for a candid conversation with the Hill Times' Charelle Evelyn on race and politics.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Charelle Evelyn. Thank you so much for being here tonight. As we just saw in that video, Parliament Hill, it's a really white place. It doesn't reflect the changing face of Canada. And Canada is supposed to be one of the top democracies in the entire world. But can a democracy, which is entirely about representation, properly function if the people aren't represented in the House of Commons? And if not, what are you prepared to do about it? So we're gonna dive into some of these really easy topics with our panel tonight. We have Celina Caesar-Chavannes, Alykhan Velshi, and Rose LeMay, and we're gonna dive right into it. So, Celina, you got the first question. Oh. And it is the first big question: can a democracy properly function if the House of Commons doesn't reflect the rest of the population? What's missing?
What's missing is the diversity in the House of Commons. And it's not just a simple question of, you know, do we elect people who look like us or having diversity of thought? I'm hearing this thing about diversity of thought. The representation does matter. And representation matters in particular when you have individuals who are willing to speak up on issues. And that can only work if you have truly inclusive spaces, spaces that allow for that diversity of thought when you have that diverse group present. If you don't allow for that diversity of thought to happen with your diverse group, then what is the purpose? And right now we have a democracy, and I would say we have a lot of companies, C-suite positions, positions in which people are in power and can influence others that don't reflect our population.
Right. Alykhan, is it a problem if the House of Commons is largely white?
I mean, I think that when we think about diversity, there's a lot of different ways that one can be diverse. You can get a diversity of political views, you can get a diversity of geographical backgrounds, you can get a diversity of language backgrounds, a diversity of ethnic backgrounds and experiences. And you know, different people kind of identify themselves and have more, along different sort of bases. And you know, to have a House of Commons that you say is sort of disproportionately white, I think can sometimes ignore two facts. One, I think the House is becoming increasingly ethnically diverse over time, and two, the fact that you know it may not have full racial diversity that reflects kind of the Statistics Canada sense of the population it kind of obscures the fact that it can have diversity across other dimensions, which for many Canadians may be more meaningful than their race.
In the United States, today is like June 19th, today's Juneteenth, right? Mm-hmm. That recognizes the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. We don't have a similar day like that here. I know that Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard, has a public bill in the Senate to have an Emancipation Day. I think it's for August 1st, 185 years after the fact, recognizing that, slavery was abolished, and it was here in Canada, and it is a fact of life, and it still has implications for today. And it took NDP MP Romeo Saganash in his private member's bill to have the government kind of change its tack on whether or not to recognize the UN Declaration Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Rose, I'm going to put to you, does representation in the House affect the priorities of the government?
Well, I sure hope it does, because this is really the point, isn't it? I think we do have a day for Indigenous. National Indigenous Day is coming up 2 days from now. And yes, we do need to celebrate all the people who have come to Canada as new settlers, as older settlers, to have a voice and to feel heard. My concern continues to be that the few Indigenous that are in positions of leadership across the political spectrum, be it the federal or provincial, territorial, municipal, are so few and far between that their voices may be silenced in the face of a very strong majority, generally white. Does that mean they're right or wrong? Not at all. If democracy works, we bring together all of our stories and we try to find the common ground. And if we can't even hear the stories in the Hill, how do we find that common ground?
Well, if you're talking about common ground, and I want to, Rose, pose to you a question that you actually posed on Twitter yourself, is democracy, is politics culturally neutral? Like, if we're looking for that common ground, does it matter where you're coming from?
Well, that is a bit of a loaded question. I'm going to say no, because there is no such thing as cultural neutrality. The thing that we are, our sense of who we are, our identity based on our teachings from our family, from our community, we bring that everywhere we go. And we see the world through our own culture. And so if we ever were to ask somebody, be it an employee or be it a policy, try to be culturally neutral, that would be trying to erase part of who we are. It's a question I would pose back, is the question is not about cultural neutrality, it's about cultural competency, cultural humility. How do we bring all of our cultures into the room without judgment and with an ability to hear each other? That's what I'm looking for.
And if you think about bringing, culture into the room, Celina, we can't ignore an elephant in the room. Obviously, you were labeled the most racist MP on Twitter because you called out racism where you saw it in Ottawa and as in your work as an MP. Certain other political leaders said that you were, more interested in looking out for color than you were in looking out for everybody as a politician. Whether positive or negative, is there a perceived bias that people of a certain ethnic background are only kind of looking out for their own communities?
I would reject that. I mean, if you hear me talking in the House or in general, I tend to speak for those who are disenfranchised within the political system. So people don't have a problem when I talk about mental health or I talk about mental health issues that affect a broad perspective of the population. But when I say the word Black, or I call out racism, or I talk about our hair, or I talk about body shaming, there's an issue with Celina and she's playing identity politics. Well, when did we not have identity politics within Canada? I was talking to someone earlier, whether we're talking about English versus French, whether we're talking about the West versus the rest, there is identity, and Rose is absolutely right. Our stories need to be brought here, and my job is not to make anybody feel comfortable in that house. My job is to represent people who are often disenfranchised and marginalized by a political process and allow them to be engaged. That is my job here. My job is to represent my community. It is not to make others feel comfortable. So I will take that most racist title, as ridiculous as it is, and yeah, bring it on.
Alykhan, you worked for Jason Kenney while he was immigration minister, and he's well regarded in various ethnic communities. How do you see that dichotomy of not being in the particular group, but representing them.
It's interesting because oftentimes the sources of tension that exist in Canada are oftentimes between different groups, oftentimes from within the same sort of source country or immigration source country. And so I think that, Jason, who I worked for, had a particular approach and a particular style that worked well. But I think that, when I think of the growing kind of diversity in the House of Commons, that's not there yet. One of the things that I learned from sort of that experience is that he made an effort to ensure that parts of the country that had been represented by people with last names like Smith and like Godfrey, but where the underlying community had been changing so rapidly, you finally had a kind of a chance for the community to be better reflected in their choice of MPs. And so you sort of had a sea change that he sort of led. And I know that he's spoken about that as something that he's quite proud of.
Before we go any further, let's take another look at some numbers that we saw off the top in the opening. So on their face, those numbers from Samara, they don't look too shabby. Visible minorities make up about 15% of the House of Commons compared to 22% of Canada's population. Indigenous MPs are about 3% of the House of Commons versus 5% of the Canadian population. So why even have this discussion? We're at near representation. Is that not enough? I'll put it to you to start, Rose.
I'm going to argue it's not enough. And I think we've seen enough reasons why in the past year. If a Caucasian parliamentarian were to disagree with his party, there might be some healthy debate. And as in any sector, if in any sector, if a Caucasian were to disagree with their organization, their company, whatever it may be, the hospital, there probably will be some healthy debate. When the Indigenous, or perhaps I, were to disagree with my organization, my hospital, my CEO, you know what I might be labeled? I might be labeled as distraction. And I think that's completely unfair and uncalled for. Is that because my views are not as important as anybody else's? Probably not. But there's an element of racism that occurs in our country where it's okay to be different until you try to voice how different that may look like to you. And that's where things are a bit messy right now, and that's why we do still need more visible minorities. We need more Black Canadians. We need more Indigenous people in the room so they don't feel like they're singled out, so they don't feel that they're on their own.
Alykhan, do you want to?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that there is certainly in Canada, I find, a lack of empathy where someone who makes an argument often has that argument judged differently based on their background, right? There's kind of an assumption that if you're making an argument that speaks to, your unique personal experiences or your background, that somehow, you're making an argument in bad faith, or that you're not making a kind of a neutral argument in the interest of Canadian as a whole. And I think that's something that that should be rejected. At the same time, I mean, what I found interesting about these sort of statistics is that they do point to the fact that there are many elements of our system of government that work, right? We can always do better, and we must always strive to do better. But I profoundly disagree that there is a crisis of lack of representation in the country. That this is the number one, number two, or even number three public policy challenge that faces the country. And I would equally disagree that the system as it currently exists is incapable of addressing this sort of on its own. So just kind of to be more precise, I think that political parties have, their purpose is to win. And, the way that you win is you represent the country as best as possible. And if you fail to do that, then you lose. And I think that creates the right internal incentives for political parties to renew themselves and over time so that they continue to represent Canadians. And I think that's a part of the system that works and that is underappreciated and underacknowledged.
I'm not sure our political systems as they stand currently do an adequate job of having representation that works in terms of building those numbers and making a concerted, active effort to build those numbers. And I mean, numbers aside, and I'm not one for quotas, I'm not one to necessarily look at numbers, but it's where those individuals are. When I'm hoping to table or introduce a bill tomorrow that looks at the number of Black individuals, Canadians within the federal public service. Where are they? There has never been in 150 years a assistant deputy minister or a deputy minister who look like me. How is that not possible? And we cannot continue to have this conversation about, well, you know, we have to find meritorious candidates. Because I've met them. I've met the ones with 2 and 3 degrees who speak 2 and 3 different languages that can't even get a managerial job. So there is a problem, and we cannot continue to have this conversation with our heads in the sand saying, well, you know, it's okay and the numbers are fine, when we know that there are barriers that people face. We have to have a candid conversation about how to dismantle some of those barriers, how to look at those numbers and figure out how to make them better, how to improve them, so that we don't have individuals who are speaking up on issues because I happen to be the Black girl in politics. I have to be the one that is only talking about Black girl issues. That shouldn't be the case. That shouldn't be the case in politics, in business, in any sector of our society. We should have actual representation that matters, that it allows those organizations to be fully inclusive of those ideas and those stories, because they are important, and we bring ideas and positive returns to anything that we're added to.
All right. Well, we've seen those numbers. Let's take a look at another video before we kind of dive into how we got to those numbers.
To claim that there's no systemic racism in Canada is a slap in the face of Indigenous peoples.
I don't think we have enough Black politicians, decision makers, policy makers, and if we are, they're not getting their foot in the door like they should be.
Part of running is you also have to win a nomination meeting. You know, you have to get out there, and you may not know a lot of people, and it takes time to break into certain circles.
We're just people, just treat us like we're people coming to visit our government. Isn't this government for us too?
So you heard in that video someone there say, you know, isn't this government for us too? And when you hear a question like that, it kind of begs another one, which is, why would people feel that way? Is it because our political system is a racist one? Alykhan, I'll start with you on that.
No, I disagree that it's a racist system. Look, my experience in politics has been entirely in one party, the Conservative Party, and so I can only really speak from personal experience about that. And, you know, although I've had, you know, my occasional difficulties amongst some of my fellow Conservatives, I don't think any have been motivated by racism, right? So I've never experienced that in my own life. That doesn't mean that others haven't, and I'm quite certain that many people have. That having been said, I profoundly reject the idea that the system on the whole, the political system on the whole, is not a good one, that is not better than most, if not all, countries, and that doesn't have the internal capabilities to sort of do things better. So no, I would disagree that we have a racist system.
Rose, I'll come to you next. You know, you can't talk about systemic issues and the system without thinking a little bit about colonialism and, you know, how does that play into whether or not Indigenous people get involved in the political system?
Well, there's a lot going on in the question. And so Canada is built on laws and legislation and colonialism, which were very much brought over from the white supremacist period of England and France, and this is all in the history textbooks. But what really gets me, and what I still think about, is that when the Indian Act was written, it was written on the premise that Indians will never achieve the intellect of adults, therefore we shall treat them in our fiduciary duty. And that's the whole basis of the Indian Act. It's still in play. 30-some revisions, they got worse and worse and worse. There were times when my great-grandparents were not allowed to gather in more than groups of 5. There were times when it's illegal to hire a lawyer. It was illegal to raise money to hire a lawyer. It's illegal to go to a pool hall. It's illegal to wear a regalia. Like, the list is long. So do I think that the system is somehow inherently still colonial? The evidence is overwhelmingly that it is. However, we never talk about it. We never talk about it because on one hand, it's incredibly painful to talk about. On the other hand, this is the hidden history of Canada. This was intentionally hidden from Canadians. I am not surprised that Canadians don't know about this. But in an era of reconciliation, and with report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, in which structures, I wouldn't say well, I don't know, Parliament has a role to play. Every leadership, governance in this country has a significant role to play so that racism is not actually deadly. And so do I feel that Parliament has a ways to go? Yes, I do. Do I think there are other countries that actually have better models than Canada? Probably yes. Are we doing better than others? Absolutely. But we also then have the capacity, and now it's just a decision if we want to do better.
As the elected representative on the panel, Celina, you're active in the system from, I guess, the ground up. What was your experience in getting involved? Did you find that there was anything systemic, standing in your way of getting a seat?
So I just want to go back to your point in that talking about systemic racism within a system is it not an indictment on the entire system. It means that we need to have conversations about what is happening. And if we cannot talk about what is happening, like you said, some of the problems that exist within the system, then we're not going to make it better. We cannot hide, we cannot internalize some of the issues that we've experienced here. We cannot continue to hide the history of our country like it didn't exist, like racism doesn't exist, like slavery didn't exist, like all of these elements did not exist, and bypass it to our present day and think that our historical context doesn't have a role to play in our modern day existence. Now, running in politics and canvassing within Whitby, which is a 80% Caucasian riding, I did not feel any ounce of racism. I did not feel that at the door. I was greeted at the door, but that doesn't, coming here and having experiences here and understanding that those individuals that said that our government should be for us, that they were profiled on the Hill, that happened. And they have every right to talk about what they experienced, because in order to make it better, we need to talk about it. It's not a complete indictment on the system, but we need to be able to make things better, and we need to be able to share those experiences and those stories and the history that led to those experiences.
And for sure, and racism is not simply the Nazi flag on somebody's house. It's the indifference. Racism also is the indifference that may be shown to people who have different perspectives because of race or culture. It's not simply the overt instances of racism which we all kind of cringe at because we know it's wrong. It's also the indifference. And that's the thing that we actually have power to change.
So how do you change it though? Because you need people who are willing to get involved and change it. So what's keeping people from getting involved in politics? What are the barriers for people to actually get through the door, get through the nomination process, and get into the House? Go ahead.
I would say that it's you know, number one, I was never asked to run. I received an email and they asked her to run a campaign, and I responded to it because I wanted to get involved. But I think that within any system, whether it's politics or business or communities, I think these conversations, what I'm hoping is that these conversations give people the tools that when they hear something or they see something that makes them cringe, that makes them think, makes them raise their eyebrow and think, that didn't sound right, that they're not just indifferent and just bypass it and say nothing. That they feel that they have the obligation to say, why did you say that to that person? Why did you do that? And not leave the onus on me as the person who is the recipient of a microaggression or overt racism to be the only one who says something. That, I think, is a challenge in a number of conversations that I've had throughout sharing my story, is that people are aware that it's wrong and it's hurtful, and it's a reason why really great people leave good organizations. Because they're tired of constantly having to defend themselves at every single opportunity against something that they don't control. And that's what we should be doing here. That's why these conversations are so important.
What about the things that you can control, if there is such a thing? You know, obviously there's a lot of internal barriers because people might look at Celina and say, you know what, she had a really rough ride. I don't want to put myself through that and get involved in politics. But what about some of the other things that might be standing in their way? Because if they can get past that internal barrier, what other hurdles do they have to jump over? Maybe Alykhan, you can speak to that.
I mean, allyship is important, calling out racism is important, but politics is inherently a rough and tumble business, right? It's not nice at any stage of the process. You know, I don't think Prime Minister Trudeau had a very happy last 6 months. You know, so even when you're at the top of the system, it's tough. And so when we think about barriers that exist throughout the system, you know, obviously a lot of the barriers are at the entry level, right? People who are under-networked in politics, people who don't, you know the right people, often have difficulty even taking that first step in the door and figuring out what is a nomination meeting. Am I the appropriate person to go to a nomination meeting, right? And so parties are working harder at recruiting from a broader pool of candidates and, you know, creating a funnel where those people work their way through the system as much as possible. At the same time, you know, adversity is such an important part of the system at every stage of the system that, you know, you can't insulate people from the rough and tumble nature of politics as a way to recruit them into the system. I think you have to be honest with people that this is not like, you know, the corporate sector where everyone is going to be nice to you and where, you get fired if you storm out of a meeting. This is politics where, you know, you're paid to bang your hands on the desk and say that someone on the other side is destroying the country. And I actually think that that's such an important feature of our system as a kind of a British Westminster-style parliamentary system that to remove that conflict, adversarial, mean element is actually removing the part that produces the clash that leads to kind of the outcomes that, you know, we sort of enjoy.
Rose, I want to come to you and talk a little bit about the clash there. For some people, you know, they can't get past that adversarial system, and for those in Indigenous communities who might come from a different way of doing things, how can you convince people to say, you know what, this is something you should be involved in?
I don't think we have a lot of answers yet, although there are a lot more Indigenous people running. And kudos to the NDP, they had the most number to run in 2015. I'm interested actually that we have a bigger conversation. It's not just Indigenous people who probably might look at question period and say, wow. I bet a lot of Canadian families look at that and say, we wouldn't allow that of our kids. Why would we allow that at a leadership level? And I want to have the conversation around let's change that system, because I'm not entirely sure that is the way that gets everybody's voice heard.
Can I just add though, like, politics is not, I see these things come up on my Twitter feed that politics is a blood sport and you need to, like, you know, I'm a Black woman, I have thick skin. Politics does not need to be a blood sport. We are there to do the work of the people, especially those who most need our government services. There has to be a level of humanity brought back into this system. I think this notion of you know, being this like tackling place, like save that for the footballers, save that for the people who actually do blood sports, and let's get to work in there in a civil way that can happen, that we could do the best for Canadians. And mind you, we may have opposing views of doing it. That doesn't mean it's a blood sport. It means that we actually have to sit down and, hey, have a conversation that doesn't involve, you know, totally ripping each other at every opportunity we have. This is not a blood sport. We are sent here by 37 million people to do good work on their behalf, and that is what we're here to do, not to play in blood.
There was a recent LeMay poll that was done for the Canadian Press, and it talked about 63% of the respondents of that poll said that they would prefer the federal government limit the number of immigrants welcome to Canada each year, because we might be reaching our limit in being able to integrate them into our communities. When Donald Trump won in 2016, Van Jones described his win as a white lash. Lots of people get their back up when Justin Trudeau talks about, you know, diversity being our strength. So why would diverse communities and diverse candidates want to get involved in this system when they could be potentially opening themselves up to something really terrible? Alykhan.
I mean, one of the things that makes Canada unique, right, when it comes to the immigration debate is that, for now at least, there is a consensus amongst the mainstream political parties in favor of maintaining, if not growing, existing kind of levels of immigration, right? I think every party, every government, certainly going back to Prime Minister Trudeau, has increased immigration levels over the previous government, right? The Harper government increased it over the Chrétien-Martin levels, and the Trudeau government has increased it over the Harper levels. And so you'll always get voices that oppose that, and oftentimes it spikes in response to particular events in the news. But thus far, the incentive for parties to pander to that sentiment seems to be a fairly fringe proposition rather than something held by all the parties. And I think we need to think through what is it that that makes Canada kind of unique in that, because I think that's something that you know, it's worth preserving. And it's the fact that I think as much as possible, all parties try to avoid politicizing these tough, or should try to avoid politicizing these tough issues of culture, even when, you know, they can get sort of short-term political advantage. And I think that that's something that is maintained this, but also that we ensure that the levels of immigration that we bring in, although high, are not so unreasonably high that it taxes the capacity of local services, right? And so the number of people from abroad who want to come into Canada probably may even be in the billions if we truly had an open door policy. But we recognize that, you know, taking our high levels and then growing them at a sustainable rate is more likely to preserve the long-term political support for immigration in the country than a kind of a reckless position in either direction.
A lot of the people from, you know, these newcomer communities are the ones who we're looking at, we're thinking about when we say we need more diversity in politics. So what are some of the things that are keeping some of these newcomers from getting involved? Is it language? Is it, like, Celina, we'll go for you.
So I would say that, you know, I can't speak to why people don't get involved, but I think calling it a blood sport, or, you know, it's being so, this is, people want to do work. And I think when we look at the immigration numbers, first of all, we need immigration for economic purposes, right? It makes good sense to do so. When we look, what we don't do a good job of is telling the story of the immigrant experience and their ability to pay back on those services within less than 10 years, their contributions to Canada, their contributions to our economic success and our GDP as a nation. We don't do a good job of telling those stories. I know, for example, that my parents, when they came here, had $100 in the 1970s, $100. And grew a company, worked hard, grew a company, did what they need to do, and paid back into that system quickly and maintained success. So I think when we talk about, you know, why don't some of those people from those immigrant communities enter into politics, I think we see that that's happening, but we need to give respect where respect is due. And we're talking about these stories about, you know, them using the system and they're coming and there's too many and they're blah, blah. What is the other side to that story? What does that other side look like? And we need to tell those stories because they make a valuable contribution. I'm an immigrant, make a valuable contribution to the success of this country. And that story needs to be told. And that invitation needs to be made to say that you belong here. And therefore, you belong in there. You belong in those seats. So let's make it a little bit more inviting for those who are often disenfranchised and marginalized from a political system, and make that invitation for them to come forward on a story of promise and success, as opposed to a story of negativity and division.
Rose, speaking of the other side of the story, I mean, the exact opposite of immigrant communities is the Indigenous communities, and who often, for reasons of ignorance, get lumped in. But what are the barriers do you see as keeping people from Indigenous communities out of politics?
I think, great comment around networking, around the networks that currently exist, and would somebody who is interested in entering into a political leadership, do they have the existing network? Do they need an invitation in? Can I just say one thing, though, as before I forget it, around immigration? I am told that Canada's social accord on immigration is partially based on First Nations perspectives. And when Parliament was actually built with English and French and Indigenous, by the way, that sense of immigration and that we accept people into our community is a bit of an Indigenous cultural way of looking at things. We don't leave anybody out, partly because it's a Canadian winter. You want to actually have people safe in your community. But the other piece is that we knew that people need community and belonging, and this is an inherently Indigenous cultural aspect to welcome people in, and this is who we used to be. Around Indigenous politicians entering into the field, likely there is some barriers around financial support, some limited networking, questions on whether or not they will actually represent more than Indigenous peoples, which I think is, I think it's a moot question. It's a totally moot question. And I wonder if in our system, if Indigenous peoples, whether they would want to actually work within the Indigenous political side, whether they start with the Assembly of First Nations or any Tapparit Kanatami or Métis National Council. We do have other Métis system, other Indigenous systems of which leaders may choose to work in as opposed to Canadian, or both. And for each of those groups, each of those sides, Parliament or Indigenous, there'll be quite a significant learning curve. And so I hold my hands out to those people who choose to do it.
Before we move on, so we've been asking for people to submit questions online, and we did get one so far. It's a question for Alykhan. How do you, as a person of color and with past professional experience with the Conservative Party, grapple with leaders or MPs who openly engage and support white supremacists. And I will couch that as kind of throwing it out to everybody with, you know, it's a party system that we have here in Canada, and for the most part, people are members of parties. How do you engage in a system where, you know, you're expected to toe the line regardless of what is being done, you know, above your pay grade? I'll start with you, Alykhan.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an unpopular view, but any party needs the occasional exercise in exclusion, the occasional purge, right? You know, the Conservative Party went through that recently with Maxime Bernier, right? And ultimately, parties are collective enterprises, and if a member holds a view that's so far outside the mainstream that it's repugnant to those in the party, or that it compromises its electoral fortunes, then the system has a way of sorting itself out and, you know, creating a fringe party on the extreme. So that's kind of, I would say, my perhaps glib, abstract view. I think more substantively, you know, we all need to call out racism and white supremacy when we see it. And I think there should be a higher expectation that we do so amongst kind of our representatives and our political leaders. And the media have a very important role to play in that, in holding people to account when they say different things in different parts of the country or to different groups. You know, I think that the system does it pretty well, right? I mean, like occasionally, I think that the past experiences in Canada of people trying to flirt with white nationalist politicians or rhetoric has tended to backfire spectacularly on the person who does it. And that's true of all parties, and I think that's a feature of our system.
Celina?
We have a responsibility once we get to this place to represent not just our base, but to represent the people that we serve, and to do it in a way that is respectful of the fact that, and I could speak for myself, I didn't just get to Parliament Hill in a borrowed job. So this job is not guaranteed forever because only Liberals voted for me. I needed to make sure that, you know, I'm representing those who were of my previous political party and those who weren't. And sometimes that conversation with yourself, that conversation with your constituents, that conversation with your party creates some tensions. And at the end of the day, I think the one thing that we need to remember as members of Parliament is how and why we got to where we are. And the answer to that is always the people. The people need to be front and center in every single decision that we make. And once we lose sight of that and start pandering towards something that we think our base will like or some particular group may like, how does that impact our policies? How does that impact our decision making if it's just to that set? We have a huge responsibility here, and I think that we need to take that very seriously, and we have to call that out. We cannot, and it's not just for up to members of Parliament to call it out for each other. The most powerful people in the room are the people sitting in those seats over there, the one who hold the one piece of currency that we enjoy, that keeps us in our jobs, and that's their voice and their vote. Their voice and their vote are so powerful, and I think sometimes Canadians forget the power with which they have to use that to say, no, we will not support what you're doing. We will not support you standing with these particular groups, and we will not vote for you next time around. And that has to be, that power needs to be removed from members of Parliament who think that that's okay, and placed squarely back where it belongs, in the hands of the people the hands of Canadians.
Rose, do you have any thoughts on this?
What she said. What she said.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about some of the barriers and some of the other things that go on that might keep people out of the political realm. We have one last video to show you guys before we talk about how do we move forward from all this.
How do we focus on the things that tie us together, bond us together, and create a culture in which people feel as if their voice matters?
We need people to vote so that the people that are at the table, the decision makers, actually reflect the people that are in this country.
We can't tackle inequality without naming the problems.
To protest is to have an unyielding faith in the power of a just society. It is not just a singular act, but it is a collective act of hope.
An absolute paradigm shift is required to dismantle colonialism in Canadian society.
Paradigm shift is required. Rose, whose job is it to get that shift to happen?
I think it's everybody's job, if you choose to. The risk is fairly high if we don't do it. The risk is actually we will lose another 300 to 400 Indigenous women and girls in the next year if we don't actually take a collective stand. And there is significant change, but I don't think we should look at this change with fear, as if somebody will lose something. I think actually if we make the shift, which Marion Buller was calling for, which Senator Sinclair called for, which Tanya Talega calls for, I think if we make this shift, we actually create belonging for everybody. It sounds so simplistic, but I believe it to be true. If we resolve the issues and barriers for Indigenous kids today, we resolve it for everybody. And we might actually like that different Canada. Imagine what if Canada were actually proud of its Indigenous roots? What if Canada knew how to support each other and actually took on some of the cultural ways which First Nations, Inuit, Métis have brought to the table? What if we leaned on the incredible expertise of Inuit around climate change and make some shifts before it's a bit too late? Like we offer a lot, and I think Canadians would like to live in that country, but we need everybody to make a shift to do it.
I would agree with what she said, but I would add, Rose, with all due respect to everybody collectively working together, that when we have, and I'll speak as myself as a member of parliament, when we have one of the biggest megaphones in the country, people are always telling me to talk into the mic and look into a camera. When we have the opportunity to do that, we have to do it in an authentic and true way. We have to raise these very awkward, uncomfortable issues in order to get that collective, that critical mass to grow. Because there is a critical mass of people who have been doing this work long before I got here, and I need to pay my respect to those individuals who have been towing the line and have been doing the work, and I just show up one day and it's all of a sudden, oh, Celina is talking about all this stuff. Well, no, there have been people who've been doing this. I think that in addition to that, we need to have courageous, bold individuals who, when they have the opportunity to do so, speak up about it. There's no point in having a whole bunch of diversity and a whole bunch of diversity of thoughts and backgrounds if everybody's going to speak to the same status quo. We need to be able to push that envelope. We need to be able to support each other. We need to be able to find allies. We need to be able to say, enough. We want better. And better is an inclusive Canada. Not just diversity is our strength as a hashtag or a slogan, but an actual, active, participatory, inclusive measure in every single aspect of our Canadian society.
Alykhan, for you, what would an ideal parliament look like?
That's a. I think that for me it would be a parliament composed of members who have a deep understanding of our history, the good and the bad, and have a good faith desire to learn from perspectives that are not their own. So I'll give an example of something that's of great sort of personal shame to me. It was several years into my service in government before I heard the phrase "missing and murdered Indigenous women." I had to ask, "What's that?" It would have been in like 2009, right? And I consider myself reasonably educated. I went to school. It never came up in any of my schooling. Didn't come up in any of my entry to politics. And I think that having the humility to accept that there's so much about our country that we don't know, both good and bad, so much to learn from, and to kind of start from the perspective that we're ignorant and there's so much we can learn from others, is I think a good place that I would like all of our parliamentarians to be, and then they can bring that perspective to kind of the quotidian tasks of governing, the sort of the left versus right, the tax cuts versus tax hikes debates. That to me would be the ideal scenario that I think folks should strive towards.
I appreciate it.
All right, so Rose, say we reach that ideal. I mean, we get a bunch of new people in who are, forward thinking and ready to embrace this world that Alykhan just described. Obviously, it's not going to be all 338 in the House of Commons. What do we do with everyone who's left? I mean, there's people who've been there for years and are very set in their ways, and how do you move their needles?
That is a great question, and I've been wondering about that in the last year. And so it brings up all sorts of models of governance. We have a model of democracy which is fairly set and has a fairly strong box. It's remarkably hard for us to think outside of that box. I was discussing with a friend of mine back in community, what would governance look like? What are other models? Because what really can push us to think outside that box is actually compare and contrast. What is Norway doing? What is Sweden doing? What is New Zealand doing? So what are First Nations? What did we used to do? We used to have, it wouldn't necessarily, it's pretty close to democracy. It was democracy plus, but it had consequence built into the system. And so if a leader were unable to fulfill their role as set by the community, there was a clear consequence. And it was quick. And then you had to trust in that consequence because the whole system was actually functioning in balance. We don't have that in Parliament. And we don't have that actually in a lot of different places across the country in a whole bunch of different sectors as it specifically relates to racism. We don't even call racism what it is in the healthcare system. It should be a patient adverse event. We don't even, there was even a Maclean's article recently that said, was making some analysis on whether or not hate crimes was increasing in the post-Trump world. And you know what? None of those databases even included Indigenous, hate crimes against Indigenous. So do we actually have systems in place that have consequence for racism? No. Is that rocket science? Actually not. We can do this, we just have chosen not to. Quite honestly, Canada's chosen not to discipline on racism. And in healthcare, in the corporate world, there's a few sectors that are doing a lot better than others, but certainly not in politics that I see. Except BC. Do you know what? BC is going to do this. BC is going to lead. They're working right now about how to legislate United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples and actually do the real analysis and change the law so that barriers are set aside and consequences are put in place when Indigenous peoples are not heard and represented. So yes, we have leaders. It's in BC.
Well, we're quickly running out of time, but I did want to go to one last question that we got on Twitter. It was probably a facetious question, but I thought it might be a really good way to kind of wrap up the night. Kay Walkdock asked, what does race have to do with politics? So, Celina, I'll start with you.
I'm hoping that Kate Walkdock was paying attention to the last hour. It has a lot to do with politics. It has a lot to do with our job. It's not even our job, it's a responsibility. People put their trust and faith in us to represent them here. And I know that we have historically low numbers of people who go out and vote. And we need to engage others to get out there and vote. However, being here means that we need to represent those individuals who are most negatively and disproportionately impacted by the policies that are and legislation that's developed in there. Mandatory minimums, justice reform, health care, those, they have a disproportionately negative impact on Indigenous people and Black communities. So what does race have to do with politics? What does race have to do with everything? Why is there a disproportionately higher number of individuals who are under surveillance by the police? Why are there a disproportionately negative health outcomes for certain groups of people? That plays into what our jobs are here. And again, if we're not looking at that from a critical lens, from an evidence-based lens, it's not Celina saying these things. This is the truth. And so race does play a role because our jobs, and again, like the legislation I'm trying to introduce tomorrow, it has to help to remove some of those barriers so we can have an even playing field, so we can have equity and justice in this country for people who have been for a long time have been disproportionately negatively affected by some of the policies that have been brought forward and by some of the outcomes that those policies ensue.
Oh, fortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I could talk about this all night. Unfortunately, we can't get to the last two, but I'm sure we'll be milling about, and if you want to hear what Alykhan and Rose have to say to that last question, you can ask them directly. Thank you guys so much for being here and having this discussion with me. I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for coming and enjoying it with us. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you heard something, you learned something. Thank you, and we'll have a good night.